Ruth Anders found the pattern before the sun found the window. She had the ledger open across the kitchen table, the lamp turned low to save the oil, and her finger moving down a column of feed purchases that Thomas Calder had made across the better part of a year. The dates for a new hay supplier sat 3 lines above the date the first mare went off her feed. The dates lined up again for the second mare. And the third. She sat very still, the way a person sits when they are afraid that moving will make the thought slip loose before they can pin it to the page. Across the room, small and silent in his nightshirt, Daniel Calder stood in the doorway with a biscuit in each hand, watching her the way he watched a hen he suspected of hiding eggs somewhere new. You found something. It was not a question. He had a way of stating things as settled fact, the same as his father. She looked up. I might have. Is it about Ginger? Ginger was the mare down in the near stall, the one who had bled from the gums 3 days running and would not take oats. It might be. Ruth turned the book so the boy could see the 2 dates, though he was too young yet to read the column heads. He looked at the numbers anyway, solemn, as if numbers alone could tell him something if he stared hard enough. Then he set one biscuit down on the table beside her hand without being asked and ate the other standing up and said nothing more about it. It was the sort of small offering that meant more than it should have. Ruth had been hired to keep the books. Nobody, least of all Thomas Calder, had asked her to find what 2 veterinary men from 2 different counties had already failed to find. She had come out from Newton 3 weeks before on the strength of a single letter, 6 lines long, offering room, board, and $11 a month to keep accounts for a horse operation that was, in the letter's own careful words, in some disorder. The disorder, once she arrived, turned out to be worse than the letter allowed. The Calder Ranch had bred good stock once, dependable animals that county men had traveled 2 days to buy, and there was still a brand on the gatepost, with some pride left in it. But the account books she found waiting for her in a tin box under the porch bench had not been touched in any orderly way for the better part of 2 years. Bills sat folded inside receipts, sat folded inside more bills, none of it dated in any order a stranger could follow, the whole business held together with a length of twine that had gone soft and gray with handling. Thomas Calder met her at the gate with his hat already off, which she took at the time for simple manners and later understood to be something closer to bracing himself. He turned his hat once in his hands before he spoke. You'll want a place to work. There's the kitchen table of an evening, once the boys fed. I don't sit at it much myself. He did not explain why. He looked instead toward the barn, with the tight patience of a man tending something that would not heal on schedule, and told her plainly what the arrangement was. Room and board. $11, paid at the month's end, not before. She would keep the accounts straight, chase what was owed him, and tell him what stood between the ranch and the note held at the bank in town. He did not ask her opinion of the horses. He did not mention that 2 men who called themselves veterinarians had already come out from Council Grove and from as far as Abilene, looked the animals over, and left with no better answer than bad luck or bad water. She learned that part from the hired man, Silas, who mucked the stalls and said little, but said it plainly. 3 mares down in 4 months, 2 of them bleeding from small places that should not bleed, 1 recovered and 2 not. And Thomas Calder had paid for 2 examinations that told him nothing he did not already know, which was that his herd was failing under him, and he could not say why. He was not a cold man. Ruth marked that early, the careful way he split kindling smaller than it needed to be so the boy could carry an armful without straining, the way he left the last of the coffee for whoever came in cold. But there was a wall in him around anything to do with figures, with paper, with the bank's letters, which he handed to her unopened the second week and did not watch her open. He said the ranch's trouble was numbers trouble as much as horse trouble, and paid her to fix the numbers and never once sat down beside her to see how it was done. She did not ask him to. Some men showed you where they were tender by what they walked around instead of through. The ranch itself told her more than he did. She learned it the way she had learned every place she had ever kept books for, by walking it before she trusted the paper. 60 head of breeding stock down to a fraction of that now, the far pasture fenced for horses that were no longer in it, a foaling barn built wide and sound by a man with money and hope, gone quiet these past 2 years. There was a second brand iron hanging unused beside the working one, worn smooth at the handle from a hand that was not Thomas Calder's, and Silas told her, without her asking, that it had belonged to Thomas's father, who had built the operation up from 4 mares and a stallion bought on credit, and had died believing his son would only ever add to it. Thomas had not touched the second iron since the funeral. He kept it hanging there anyway, the way a man keeps a debt he intends to pay, even when he cannot yet say how. She began her work in the only order that made sense to her. Oldest paper first, sorting the tin box's contents into a stack for feed, a stack for wages, a stack for the bank, and a 4th stack, thin and troubling, for bills that had gone unpaid long enough to draw a second and sharper notice. It was slow work by lamplight, her eyes going tired over handwriting that was not always Thomas's own. Some of it the mill's clerk, some of it a neighbor's boy paid a nickel to write a receipt plain. She kept at it past the hour most households had banked their fires, because the sooner the numbers stood straight, the sooner she could turn her attention to whatever was actually killing the horses, and some stubborn part of her had already decided the two problems were not as separate as Thomas believed. The boy's first gesture came on a Tuesday, though she did not think of it as a gesture until later, only as a small mercy. She had been 3 evenings running at the kitchen table with the tin box's contents spread in front of her, sorting receipts into piles by month, and on the 3rd evening she came in from the barn to find her usual chair, the one nearest the lamp, already pulled out and turned to catch the light properly. Daniel was under the table at the time, playing some private game with a spool and a length of string, and when she thanked him he only shrugged one shoulder, the way his father shrugged, and went on with the spool. The next evening the chair was pulled out again before she came in. She began to notice him watching her work in the particular way a child watches an adult they have decided, privately and without announcement, to like. He brought her the good pencil, the one with a full point, instead of the stub that lived in the drawer. He counted eggs out loud when he gathered them, 12, 13, 14, because he had heard her counting figures under her breath and seemed to think it was a game they now shared. Once he brought her a tin cup of coffee gone half cold from sitting on the stove too long and set it by her elbow without a word. The same quiet way his father always saved the dregs of the pot for whoever came in shivering, and went back to his string before she could thank him for it. He never said in those first weeks that he wanted her there. He was 8 and careful and had watched his father's face enough times to have learned that some things are better shown than said. But he began, without anyone remarking on it, to leave a space for her. A second plate set before she had come in to ask for one. A second boot scraper cleared of mud on the porch step, though there had only ever needed to be the one. Small things. Ruth had grown up the eldest of 6 with very little that was only hers, and she recognized in the boy's small offerings something she had not let herself want in a long while, which was to be counted, without asking, as one of the ones a household kept room for. Thomas saw it. She caught him seeing it, once from the barn door, the boy pulling out her chair, and Thomas standing very still with a coil of rope over one shoulder, watching his son do it. He did not say anything about it that night or any night after. But he began leaving the coffee pot a little fuller each morning. Enough for 2 without either of them saying so, and that was its own kind of saying. The pattern in the feed dates took her most of 2 weeks to trust and another week to prove. She had gone back through the receipts far enough to find that the ranch had changed hay suppliers the previous autumn, a man out past the county line offering a better price on baled hay than the mill in town could match. The first mare had sickened 7 weeks after the new hay came in. The second, 9 weeks after a second delivery from the same source. The third had gone off her feed within days of the most recent load. Ruth had grown up on a farm before her father lost it, and she remembered, the way a person remembers the smell of a room from childhood, an old argument between her father and a neighbor about sweet clover, cut too late and cured too damp. Hay that looked sound enough to a man's eye and was not sound at all. Hay that could rot a horse's blood from the inside without ever showing a mark on the outside until the bleeding started. She had been perhaps 10 years old when she heard it argued over a fence and had not thought of it again in 15 years until she sat at the Calder kitchen table with 3 dates circled in pencil and felt the old memory turn over like a stone in a creek bed, showing its underside. She rode out to the hay barn herself the next morning, before Thomas was up, and pulled apart 3 bales with her bare hands until she found what she was looking for near the center of the second one, where the sun had never reached it to dry it properly. A patch gone gray-green and faintly sweet-smelling, soft, where good hay should have held its shape. Not moldy in any way a careless eye would catch. Wrong in the particular, patient way that only shows itself to someone looking for it. She had heard her father say, standing at that old fence line years before, that sweet clover cured wrong did not smell wrong to speak of, and looked, to a man in a hurry, near enough like any other bale. And that was exactly the danger of it. It wanted a slow hand and a suspicious one. Someone willing to pull a bale to pieces on no more than a hunch built from a column of dates. A veterinary man came to look at a sick animal and search the animal. He had no cause to go tearing bales apart with his bare hands in a stranger's barn, not when the books that would have pointed him there were folded into a tin box under a porch bench. Twine gone soft, months out of order. She brought Thomas out to see it before breakfast and stood back while he turned the spoiled patch over in his hands, the slow, careful way he handled anything he was not sure he could judge alone. She held the gray-green patch out on her open palm. This is what's killing them. Not the water. Not bad luck. Spoiled clover hay, cured too wet, fed steady for months. It thins the blood. Slow. At first. Then it doesn't. He did not answer right away. He held the rotten hay a long moment, and something crossed his face that was not quite relief and not quite shame, the two so close together in a proud man that they can be hard to tell apart. 2 vets stood in this barn. His jaw worked once before the rest came. Neither one pulled a bale apart. She let the silence sit before she answered it. They were looking at the horses. I was looking at what you paid for. He looked at her then, not the way he had looked at her the first week, taking her measure as hired help, but the way a man regards someone who has just handed him back something he had given up on finding. He did not thank her in words. He took his hat off, which she had learned by now was the closest he came to it, and stood holding it while the gray morning light came up over the barn roof, and said only that he would have Silas pull every bale from that lot and burn what needed burning. They did it together that same afternoon, the 3 of them, hauling bad hay out to the far corner of the yard where the smoke would not blow back over the stalls, Daniel trotting behind with an armful too big for him and refusing to be told it was too heavy. The fire took slow at first, the damp hay smoking gray-white before it caught, and Thomas stood close to it longer than the heat called for, watching a season's bad luck burn down to ash, while Ruth kept the boy back a safe distance with one hand on his shoulder and did not let go of it until the flames had settled. The trouble was that burning the bad hay solved one problem and uncovered another. which was money, and the note the bank in town held against the ranch, due at the start of the coming month. The bank held paper on the ranch from a hard winter 3 years back, and the note had a term attached that Ruth found buried in the language on the third reading, a clause allowing the bank to call the balance due in full if the herd's condition, as judged by an independent examination, showed continuing decline. 2 failed veterinary visits sat in the bank's file as exactly that kind of decline. A third visit was already arranged, a county inspector named Purnell coming out from Council Grove the following week, and Mr. Voss from the bank riding out alongside him to see the books and the herd together and decide, on the strength of both, whether the note would stand or be called. Thomas told her this the way he told her most things that shamed him, standing at the door with his back half turned, as though the wall between the kitchen and the yard made an easier audience than her face would. He had not told the bank about the hay. He had not told them anything, because he did not trust himself to sit across a desk from Voss and hold his own in an argument built on figures and clauses. He had sent word only that the ranch would be ready for the inspection, and beyond that he had said nothing, because saying nothing felt safer than saying the wrong thing and being caught at it. Ruth understood, watching him, that the wall she had noticed his first week was not pride exactly. It was closer to what she had seen in her own younger brother, who could not read past his letters and had spent a childhood finding reasons to leave a room rather than be handed a paper and asked what it said. Thomas Calder could keep an account in his head well enough for feed and wages, but a bank's clause, a column of compounding figures, a contract laid flat and expected to be read aloud, these things closed something in him that had nothing to do with courage, and everything to do with a boy somewhere behind the man who had never been taught and had spent 30 years making sure nobody found out. He told her, once, his shoulder against the doorframe and his gaze fixed somewhere out past the corral, that his father had kept every figure the operation ever needed in his own head, and had trusted no clerk and no bank with a single column of it, and had died sudden in a fall from the loft before he had taught his son the trick of it. Thomas had been 19 that winter, with a herd to feed and a mortgage he only half understood and no one left to ask. He had muddled through on instinct and a fair memory for prices ever since, and it had held well enough in good years, and had come apart entirely the moment the herd itself turned sick and the account book's disorder and the herd's decline arrived in the same season, each one making the other look worse than it was. She did not say any of that to him. She only said that she would have the books ready, every figure accounted for and set down plain, and that when Voss and the inspector came, Thomas would not need to read a single column aloud that he did not want to. He looked at her for a long moment and said that would do. The week that followed was the hardest work she had done since coming to the ranch, 3 straight evenings past midnight with the account book and every scrap from the tin box, building a clean record from a tangled one, tracing every dollar the ranch had spent on the bad hay and every dollar it would save by the change, laying it all out plain enough that a stranger could follow it without help. Daniel took to bringing her coffee unasked every night that week, and once fell asleep under the table with his head on her foot, and she worked around him rather than wake him, the way she imagined a mother might. The morning Purnell and Voss rode in, the yard was swept, the sick mare was up on her feet and taking feed again, and Thomas Calder stood by the corral fence in his good coat, looking like a man walking to his own trial. Voss was a narrow, precise man who dismounted without offering his hand and asked, almost before his boots touched the ground, to see the books. Purnell went to the horses. Thomas led Voss toward the porch, and Ruth watched something happen in his shoulders as they walked. A kind of bracing she had seen in him only once before, the morning she showed him the rotten hay. Voss set the ledger open on the porch rail and ran one gloved finger down a column and asked Thomas, in the flat voice of a man used to being obeyed, to account for the change in supplier and explain the figure noted against it. Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. He looked at the column the way a man looks at a locked door he has been handed no key for, and Ruth saw the old shame climbing up the back of his neck in a slow red tide, and took one step forward to speak for him, because she could not stand to watch it a second longer. She never got the chance. Daniel got there first. He came off the porch step at a run, small and fierce, and put himself between his father and the ledger with the particular righteousness of a child, defending something he has decided is his to defend. He had the second copy in his hands, the one Ruth kept for herself, clutched against his chest like something precious, and he held it out not to his father, but to Ruth. His voice was steady and very loud for a boy his size. She does the numbers. Pa doesn't have to guess at them. She writes them down true, and I've watched her do it every night, and they're right. You ask her, not him. He doesn't need to guess. Voss looked at the boy with the faint, startled expression of a man who has forgotten that children are capable of interrupting adults on purpose. Thomas made a small sound, not quite a word, and put his hand on his son's shoulder, not to pull him back, but to hold him there, as if some part of him had been waiting a long while for permission to stop guessing in front of strangers. Purnell, coming up the path in time to catch the tail of it, looked between the boy and the man and did not ask what had passed between them. He was a practical sort, more used to reading a horse's gum line than a household's private business, and he only touched his hat to Ruth and said he would want to look at whatever record she kept of the feed changes, since a clean account of dates would save him an hour of asking the same questions of 3 different people. Ruth took the ledger and answered every figure Voss asked after, plain and complete, the spoiled hay and the burned lot, and the sum it had cost against the sum it would save, the mare already back on her feed, as proof the fix had held. Voss listened, asked 2 hard questions, and got 2 straight answers, and by the time Purnell came up from the corral to say the mare's gums had color back in them and the others looked sound, the narrow set of his mouth had eased into something closer to satisfaction than either of them had expected from him. The note would stand. Voss said as much before he remounted, in the same flat voice he had used for everything else, though he paused at the gate long enough to say the books were the cleanest set he had seen come off a ranch that far from town, and that whoever kept them ought to be worth what she was paid. Thomas did not say much until the 2 men were well down the road. Then he stood a while by the gatepost, hat in his hands, looking at the dust settling behind their horses, and Daniel still pressed against his side, with the spare copy clutched to his chest, as though he had not yet decided it was safe to let go of it. He did the thing 3 days later, on a Sunday, without telling her beforehand. He rode into town at first light and came back near noon with the county recorder's papers folded in his coat and asked her to come out to the barn, where the ranch's working brand had hung over the big double doors since before he was born, worn but proud, the letters "Car" burned deep into old wood. He had a fresh board with him, planed smooth, and a branding iron heated at the forge, and he set the board against the barn wall beneath the old one and pressed the iron to it himself, slow and careful, the way a man does a thing he means to be permanent. When he stood back, the board read Calder and Anders, the letters still smoking faintly at the edges. He set his hat against his chest before he spoke, the way a man stands for something solemn. The recorder's got it filed as of this morning. Half the operation's yours on paper now. Not the house, not the boy. But the herd, the ground, and every figure in that book, half of it's yours to keep or spend as you see fit, same as mine. He did not make a speech beyond that. He stood bareheaded in the yard, plain and still, waiting to see what she would say. Ruth looked at the board a long moment, at the letters still dark and raw where the iron had bitten in, and understood that this was not a thing a man like Thomas Calder could take back even if he wanted to. A recorder's filing did not unfile itself. A brand did not unburn. She said yes before she had decided, in any careful way, to say it. It came out of her plain and certain, the same way his own words tended to. By the time the first frost came, Ruth's chair sat permanently at the head of the kitchen table nearest the lamp, and nobody pulled it out for her anymore because nobody needed to. It had simply become hers, the same quiet way the second cup on the shelf was hers now, the same way the account book, with 2 names written plain across its spine, belonged to her. Most evenings Daniel did his letters at the far end of the same table while she worked the figures, and some nights he fell asleep there with his cheek against his own slate before Thomas carried him off to bed. The mare called Ginger came back to full weight before the first snow and stood sound enough by winter to be shown to a buyer without apology, and Silas took to saying, whenever anyone asked after the herd, that the operation had 2 doctors now, one for the animals and one for the paper, and that the second had likely saved more of them than the first ever could have. Ruth still sat there most nights after the house had gone quiet. The lamp burned low, the account book square in front of her, with both their names inked plain across the top of the page. Daniel's boots sat by the door now, instead of at the foot of his bed, set there each evening so he could be first out to the barn come morning, and some nights passing through to bank the fire. Thomas paused behind her chair a moment before he went on to check the latch.